Once upon a time, in a room full of wonders, where every step leads to magic, and the journey of a true story begins here, with amazing guests and true miracles. Please like and subscribe for more amazing videos.
So in my case, the near-death experience part of this for me took place at the age of 29 years old. I was recovering from a surgery. I was not in the hospital any longer. This was not some sort of operating table near-death experience or something like that. The operating table was 4 days before. I was in the hospital four days in recovery. The surgery was to remove a great deal of tissue in the back of my throat, the soft palate. They removed a few chips of bone from the skull behind my nose. And all of this was a response to a sleep apnea issue that was just sort of a genetic quirk of my own makeup, and had put me in a state of sort of mild to severe sleep deprivation for the first part of my adulthood, basically. So at 29, this is getting solved by doing this surgery. The surgery itself is not done very often these days any longer. One of the reasons, there are many, but one of them is that it's an exceptionally painful recovery. And I was warned about that, and the doctors had a lot to say about that ahead of time. And just to put it into some kind of context, because it's certainly quite relevant for the rest of the story, but beforehand, one of the doctors had said to me, "Jonathan, you're going to have to see what it's like to essentially break your leg and then have to walk on it for days." And they were just trying to describe to me the kind of level of pain that this might be involving. And it was somewhat unfortunately quite accurate. Anyway, they medical care in America, sometimes it has its quirks, and this is not the time to debate any of that, but 4 days after the surgery, they've sort of kicked me out of the hospital into the care of my father. I'm 29 years old, so I'm a functioning grown-up, but my father had decided he wanted to watch over me in the healing, in the next little period of time while I healed up. And so he came and got me from the hospital and drove me out to the family farmhouse, which is like 2 hours away from the city, and was going to watch over me there. There really was next to nothing for him to do. There really wasn't anything he could do other than sort of look in on me, during the day and see if I was still sitting upright. And there wasn't much for me to do either other than stare out a window. And so he spent his time doing house chores and farm chores and whatever he was doing. And about on the third or fourth, I've actually forgotten, the third or fourth day into his care, I just internally experienced what I can best describe as an exceptionally clear inner click. And in the moment of that click, I recognized instantly that the life force in this body was beginning to drain away. The body was going to begin to shut down and was essentially beginning to die. And in the same moment of that click, there arose 3 recognitions that all sort of flood in simultaneously, even though I can only describe them sequentially, but it all sort of happens all at the same time. The first recognition that floods in the moment of that click was simply that it was the recognition that I wasn't my body. And the way that manifested was that it was very clear that the aware consciousness in me, that awareness, was aware that the body was dying. But it was very clear that that awareness was not of that body. The awareness itself wasn't actually changed at all. It wasn't dying. And I hope we'll have time to come back to this, simply because that recognition in that moment wasn't actually the first time I'd encountered that. But it was among the clearest, and it was among the most powerful I'd encountered something like that a handful of other times as a child, actually. And I think those experiences as a child probably made it more possible than usual for that recognition to sort of flood in this particular moment. But one of the things that did make this moment different than some of the ones in the past was the fact that there was offered in this a level of freedom that I hadn't perceived in the past, and that's because of that absolutely blackout level, mind-bending level of pain. Because in the moment of recognizing now that I wasn't my body, I could also see clearly that I didn't need to identify with the pain in that body either. And so it was in this moment that I got to see the difference between pain and suffering and be released completely from the suffering of it. And that was, it's just a level of freedom that is difficult to describe. To get to presumably whatever is on the other side of this, which, you know, we hope as intended is some level of healing, and this whole issue of sleep apnea is solved and all of that, and it's just like this is going to be like walking over broken glass for a while, but you know, hopefully eventually that will subside. But you know, really just the massive physical pain that goes on for days can wear a person down pretty quickly. And so when this moment arrives in recognizing that the body is beginning to die and that I'm not my body, that now if I'm not my body, then I'm not the pain in that body either. I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to tell a story about it. I don't have to connect to it in a way that's so intertwined with who I think I am that, you know, all of that is let go of in this moment. And to be clear, it doesn't mean that the pain in the body has ceased. It didn't. It hadn't. It was as present as ever, and you know, incredibly intense. It's just that intensity didn't need to be connected to, because it clearly wasn't me. It's like taking, and this is a phrase I've returned to many times since, it was like taking what I began to think of as a backward step. Or I had thought of it that way as a child too, when I had sort of encountered this experience where I could curiously sort of take this backward step from my own consciousness. But you know, in times past, there had never been this situation where there was so much pain. You know, unlike the present with this moment, and so it was an extraordinary freedom. And that's why I couch it in terms of seeing the difference between pain and suffering, because the pain was literally still there in that body. I just didn't need to suffer from it. I wasn't suffering from it in any way. It was a complete release from the suffering, even though there was still pain in that body. And that's not something that entirely left me either. I was going to, you know, there were times in the future, well past this event, that I was going to be put back in touch with that as well. But at the moment, it was sort of the first of the sort of revelations that flooded in. The second recognition that flooded in the moment of this click was simply that the life force in this body was draining away, but it was draining away relatively slowly, and that it was going to take time, that, you know, that sort of absolute final doorway was going to be a few days out. And that sort of settled in a way that was, I found very comforting, actually. It was sort of as though my reaction to that then was that I was going to have a few days to revel in this experience and revel in the freedom that I had just tried to describe. And that presented itself as a fascinating possibility. More than anything, and this leads very much into the third thing that arose, it didn't render the fact that I was dying as an urgent problem. It was the opposite of that. It was more like, oh, this is fascinating. And I'm so delighted to have clearly be given some time to sort of sit with it and spend time with it. This is marvelous. And I think that's perhaps better explained as I move into this sort of third revelation that settled in, and to articulate that, I need to still go back to the first one, in which there was this very, again, clear sense that I wasn't my body. So to clarify that a bit more, there was an aware consciousness, yes. Sometimes in spirituality it's referred to as the witness, and that's a very good word for it in my case, that I was witnessing the body, but that aware witness, that aware consciousness was itself not dying, wasn't impugned or harmed in any way by what was happening to that body. It was as vibrant, present, and alive as ever, as always. In fact, it has to it a quality that makes it almost impossible to understand where did it begin. Like, it has a feeling of eternality to it. Like, there's no way I could put my finger on when that aware consciousness might have been, quote unquote, born. The idea of being connected to this body in that way didn't even make any sense at all. But it was a sense of self, like there was a sense of an individuated sense of self. It was just one that was aware and not limited by that body, that's all. So, but yet there's still this sense of being a separate but non-corporeal self. Yet in the third recognition that began to flood in, what was seen and experienced was that separate but non-corporeal sense of being, sense of self, was beginning to dissolve. It was itself beginning to fade and dissolve. That's the best word I can think of. And it was dissolving into what I can only describe as the absolutely all-encompassing, allness. So it would dissolve into what was overwhelmingly whole. And it was essentially beginning to lose its individuality, its sense of separateness. And what I would want to stress about that more than anything at all is that there could not possibly have been a sense of loss in that. Because if something is dissolving into what is absolutely all-encompassingly whole, that wholeness is missing absolutely nothing. That's what makes it whole. And if it's missing absolutely nothing, then there could not be any sense of lack or want or need. And if there is none of those things, then there is essentially no possibility for there to be fear. What could there possibly be to be afraid of? There couldn't have been, there wasn't. And so it was a dissolution or dissolving that, it sounds paradoxical, but it's a dissolving into what is absolutely overwhelmingly whole, missing nothing, and therefore impossible for there to be fear or any sense of loss at all. And one of the things that we've, especially people on what you might call a spiritual path, have probably long been familiar with is the idea that perhaps love is the opposite of fear. And if there cannot possibly be fear, then the sort of natural default setting then is something very loving and very peaceful. And again, if there is something, if the experience is one in which there is a total lack of want or need or lack of any kind, then it's natural then to see that how could that be anything other than profoundly peaceful? And that's exactly how it presents itself. That's how I experienced this. It's also why when relatively soon after these things sort of come flooding in, and relatively soon after this inner click, at some point my father appears in the doorway. And he checks in on me like he has been. And again, there's, for a number of days now, there hasn't been much for him to do. He just kind of looks and sees if I'm still sitting up straight, if I'm all right. And this is exactly what he does in this particular moment. And there is no impulse in me whatsoever that arises to say anything like, hey, I think I'm dying, that doesn't even seem relevant. It doesn't present itself as a problem. How could it be a problem if there's no sense of lack or want or need of any kind? And the only natural response in any way whatsoever, knowing also that there's no way I could look at my father and explain to him in a way that he would understand that myself and my body were two different things, and one of them was essentially irrelevant. Irrelevant to the point that if that body was dying, it wasn't even a meaningful detail. And so the only natural response was to see him appear in the doorway, smile back at him, say absolutely nothing, feel tremendously loving towards him and overwhelming peace. And that's all. And that is how I spent the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. The phrase from a popular source is often noted as the peace that passes all understanding, which is a phrase that's been near and dear to my heart ever since. And because it passes all understanding, it doesn't present as something that is easily articulated or explained, but also that there's no need to do so. There's no drive to do so. It just is. And it's just automatically shared in ways that mostly don't involve words, which seems like the most beautiful vessel for holding it anyways. And so at that moment when my father appeared, and the moments subsequent to that when he reappeared, I was silent, and essentially sharing that peace with him in the only way that made sense to me at the time. That's how I went into that night. For at this point nearly a solid week I'd barely slept, because that's difficult to do when you're in otherwise mind-bending levels of pain. And on this particular night, I did sleep. And I also woke up periodically through the night. Every time I would wake up, I would check in with my, this whole situation, be like, am I still dying? Yes, I can feel that life force ebbing away, flowing out, draining, and draining faster. And I can feel my body slowing down, and I can feel that merging with the infinite, speeding up in exactly the same rate that my body is losing its life force. I awake the following morning with the same, and there comes a point the following morning when this thought arises in my mind also, which is something like, this doesn't, there'll become a limit. Like it was as though, and I say this metaphorically, it was a visual representation to me, but I recognized this as a visual metaphor for what was happening inside me, which was a very literal image of a threshold and a doorway, and that I was going to have a choice. I could go through the doorway, or I could choose not to go through the doorway. That choice was up to me completely. There was no difficulty or effort in making the choice in any way whatsoever. It had nothing to do with merit or worthiness or anything like that. It was simply, you have a choice to go through that doorway or not. And this question arises in my mind, like, well, why wouldn't you go through that doorway? We are talking about the peace that passes all understanding, and the overwhelming experience of absolute all-encompassing allness in a way that which time has no meaning. It is the kind of thing that is difficult to describe without using words like eternal, and difficult to describe without potentially even using words like heaven, because what could heaven be other than something that is everlasting, in which there is no lack or want or need or fear of any kind, and therefore nothing but perfect peace and absolute love. And so what a natural question then to say, well, why wouldn't you go through that doorway? It's a good question. And to my surprise, what arose in my mind also was a thought that said something like, well, I think it's just not time yet. In fact, I think there's things I need to do here first. And the truth is, I don't even know what they are. When that thought arose, I was surprised. I'm like, my very, whatever human part of myself was, still, really engaged in this way, was like, well, but I don't even know what I would be doing here. I'm 29 years old and I really haven't figured it out at all at this point. And maybe the next, or the first step after all of this is to literally figure out what I am to be doing here, because I really don't know. But I cannot shake the feeling that I'm not quite done, and I got to do some things. I guess I'll have to figure out what they are first. But I think I'm not going to go through that doorway. And it was really close. It was like 51% stay, 49% go ahead and go. Why not? And yet, I thought, no. I think I cannot help listening to that little grain of guidance that says, you got some stuff to do. So do it first. And you can come back to this place anytime later. Anytime. In fact, it's guaranteed. But finish your work first. So, that's sort of, I summarize a sort of process that's gone through my head throughout the entire rest of the following day. And by the time I've come to sort of a resolution of it, like I think I'm going to stay, lo and behold, my father appears in the doorway yet again, and this time his whole thing, his face changes, and he looks at me and he squints his eyes at me, and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car and head back over to the hospital. To which I think, all right, fine. I think that means I'm staying. And again, he doesn't have any idea of all of what's gone on, inside me during all of this time. But when he says that little thing in me that had decided, I think maybe I'll stay, just sort of pinged, and it was like, oh, well, there we go. I guess we'll go back over to the hospital then. Fine, sounds fine. And off we go. It's a substantial, it's a couple hours drive. We go back to the hospital that conducted the original surgery. The docs in the hospital confirm that I am in fact dying immediately upon being admitted. And I'm dying for the stupidest reason in all of medical science. I am dying from dehydration. They had kicked me out of the hospital essentially in a state in which it was more or less impossible for me to eat or drink. And again, that, we could say that begs questions about things like healthcare in America, but that we need not debate now at all. But that was essentially the facts of it. And so I had lost a bunch of weight from an otherwise very healthy frame. And dying of dehydration also means the fix is very simple. So they poke an IV bag with saline solution into my arm, and immediately I begin to feel that life force draining away. It just reverses, and that life force begins to feel as though it flows back in. That merging with the infinite also begins to reverse, and I am very clearly coming back from that infinite. I'm going to put my feet back on the ground here. It's all reversing. And they hold me there in the ER for a few hours to observe, and everything's fine, and they let us go. We take another 2-hour drive back to the house, and I begin to, really, the healing really accelerates for me, and it takes a solid 3 weeks. But 3 weeks later, I return to my own home. I return to my job and regular life. And I've often been asked, well, wasn't this the most pivotal experience you've ever gone through? And the answer was no. And the reason it was no was because when I got back to work, I couldn't figure out how to reconcile what I knew that I knew, what I'd seen that I'd seen, with running late for work. And all of a sudden this body seemed terribly important in all of its machinations. And the whole story of this young life just seemed so difficult to reconcile the minutia of everyday life with the experience that I had, that I just couldn't put them together in a way that made sense to me. And so what I did with this experience at first was bury it. I certainly spoke nothing of it. I didn't tell a story like this for many years. My father never heard it. He never heard this story. And I don't believe that at the time he was around that he would have been able to hear it, actually. And that's probably true of a lot of people, but I think that was true of him. And so what the experience did was turn me privately, quietly, very internally into much more of a spiritual seeker. And simply because that drive to reconcile what I knew that I knew with how odd, how opposite it seemed like ordinary, regular life seemed, that had to be resolved. And so that became sort of my internal drive over the next decade, really. And what that led to was a wide range of other experiences that I found, some of them equally as mind-bending as the one I've just shared, where I ended up revisiting many of these kinds of experiences. I revisiting many other related experiences around the subject of death and dying. 10 years after this experience, I'm at my father's bedside while he's dying, and I have this extraordinary experience with him. He's in a state of septic shock. He's unconscious. In the words of the nurse at the time, he's more than half out the door already, in her words. And I have one of the most beautiful experiences with my father that I'd ever had, which was in the business these days, they call it a shared death experience, a term that I just learned. And in this, I felt as though I joined with him, you could say on an energetic level or a spirit level or something like that, and a soul level. I felt I joined with him. It was intensely vivid to me as I sat with him silently at his bedside. And it was we joined together, and I walked him together to the very edge of that infinite. And we sort of sat on the edge of this infinite and looked out into it in a way that was just difficult to put into words. It was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had with my father. And what I knew is that there's no way I could have walked into the edge there without having known the place myself from my own previous experience. And so I thought back on my own experience and remembered for a split second the absolutely mind-bending amount of pain that was involved in getting to my own experience. But in that moment, there was nothing but the most overwhelming gratitude, and the memory of that physical pain just it was rendered so simply irrelevant. Like there was no residue of it left in any way whatsoever. In fact, it was seen as having been essentially an illusory aspect of my own experience. Powerfully illusory, powerful, but yet still illusory. And as I sat and looked into the infinite there with my father, knew simply that in a very short period of time, he was going to take one more step fully and completely into it, and I would remain here, and that I was going to have this opportunity to share this moment with him, and to take it back into my own life as well, which is exactly what happened. That afternoon, his doctors came to me. They had already come to my stepmom. She had had a complete breakdown, and came to me, bawling her eyes out, saying, I can't do this. I can't do it, Jonathan. You have to take care of this. And I knew that without any shadow of a doubt, she was right, and that I was, of all my family members, easily and far away the one most capable, because of the experiences I'd had. And so it fell to me to let the doctors know when to unhook the machines and let him die. That was my prerogative. And so there came a moment just among all the family members when that, it was an appropriate time came, and I was the one that had to give that order. And I met that moment in a way that was, I had tears running down my face, but I can say unequivocally that I didn't have any fear about it, and I knew that all was well, and that my father was was in the midst of taking that one more step into what for him was going to be the most beautiful experience he had ever had. And there was no way I could be a part of that without there being a sense of genuine gratitude and beauty to share with others. I've ended up working with tons of other people. I've had shared death experiences with other people. There have been other occasions when, sometimes intentionally and sometimes quite unexpectedly, I've sort of helped someone else cross over. And one of the things that I've taken away from all those experiences is that all of us tend to experience these things in a way that is most meaningful for us. Meaning the actual content of what I saw was because that's what was meaningful for me. And I make a distinction between the content and the underlying truth. So it seems as though it's simply that whatever that underlying truth is, and it always eventually comes down to something loving, gets represented to us in ways that are meaningful to each individual person. And sometimes that takes the form of having met other individual people that they loved, or seeing a vision in some way that is particularly uniquely meaningful for them. And the sort of visual or perceptual form of those things doesn't really matter. It's the underlying content of that lovingness, however it's represented to us, that is ultimately the most meaningful, not the form in which it appears. But thankfully, it tends to appear in a form that is most useful, most accessible, most understandable to each of us. And to me, there's a great beauty in that. Just to clarify, and specifically for those people, like, is it possible that someone goes through a physical experience that would involve physical pain, like in an accident or something like that, or anything? Well, sure. It's just that in the sort of final analysis, that pain is rendered irrelevant. It simply ends up being not meaningful, not impacting, not relevant, and in the end is seen as sort of a figment of the experience, perhaps, but one that didn't really have any impact or any real effect. And if it didn't have any real effect, then it's not really a thing. It's just not an issue. It's just not an issue at all. One of the things I would highlight about the story I've already told is that there was this dissolution of a sense of an individuated sense of self. And that was really at the core of so much of the experiences that were coming my way. And the biggest shift of all that I've ever gone through was not the NDE, as I described, as it just took so long to sort of understand and reconcile with that. But there came a point when it was possible to look inside and discover that sense of individuated sense of self inside simply wasn't as true as I had sort of always believed. And I had to look at that thousands and thousands of times, it seemed like. But the biggest shift that really turned this life upside down in a wonderful way was after a long process of that kind of looking over and over and over, in which the fundamental truth of that lack of an individuated self just sort of settled in permanently, and that is what afforded a kind of shift in the baseline level of peace. And it's from that peace that I had to completely realign what it meant to be here, and completely realign how to look upon the world, and to my own experience in it, to others' experience in it. It's out of that fundamental peace that eventually arose things like my own intuitive abilities, some sense of some healing gifts and things like that, and all of that for me took quite a while to actually sort of settle in and get used to, frankly. But it's also become at the core of how I move in the world, and also how I interact with the world, and work with people too, that come to me, and have a little healing experience of their own. And I hope and presume very much that is for a bit of that healing to be offered to the world. Yeah, and it's no. In the end, they're going to discover what they discover has always been with them and in them, and it's just been temporarily obscured and covered over. But what they end up finding is some sense of truth with a capital T that they recognize has always been within them and will always be within them. And that is a strong foundation. There is actually an opportunity for people to be in touch and see me in person in Seattle, and also in Sedona, and there'll be some other places too coming up soon. I couldn't say where exactly yet, but anyone is welcome to reach out. I encourage absolutely anyone. Wherever you are in your own spiritual journey, you are welcome to this table. The actual mechanics of it usually sort of fall into two categories. One of them is simply beginning to pick apart all the structures inside someone that have kept the status quo in place. And so any kind of steps on the journey here, what we could call them spiritual journey or any other, or just regular life journey, doesn't really matter. But if things are going to change, then that structure ends up changing. What I mean by changing is that there are aspects of it that are seen through, let go, given up. It's a process of dissolution and removing of blocks more than it is acquiring anything. And I do often put my hands on people's heads. That's something I haven't talked about that much lately, but that is something where we just spend some time silently. And if I had to put an activating mechanism to it, it would be more like mind than anything else. Because in the end, it is mind and I mean mind with a capital M, that's what creates our experience more than anything else. So if we're not working at the level of the mind, then we're really just moving chess pieces around without doing a whole lot. And so, and in the end, one of the ways I've described it is healing by divine principle. And the reason I think of it in those terms is that I, as an individuated self, Jonathan, I don't see that as being particularly relevant. I'm not moving chess pieces around. I'm not moving energy or doing Reiki or checking Akashic records or talking to angels or guides or whatever. It's none of that. It's letting that go completely to that all-encompassing wholeness. And there's something about that that tends to put this person I'm working with in touch a little bit more with that all-encompassing wholeness as well. And it rises up within them in some way that is understandable to them, accessible to them, acceptable to them. And it's from that source then that they have an opportunity to let something else go, or to make a different choice, or to see something new, or to approach something from a different manner, to get their own guidance. And so from my point of view, it's really coming from source with a capital S, not from me, which I'm very grateful for.